This is Behind the Headlines, with behind-the-scenes analysis on issues affecting Pennsylvanians, sponsored by the Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy. Now, here's your host.
Hi, from Philadelphia to Erie and from Scranton to Pittsburgh, it's Behind the Headlines. I'm Charlie Greenewalt, Senior Fellow of the Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy, and my co-host, Maura Donnelly, is on assignment today. So we will be running solo on this particular show, but we have a wonderful guest for you, and we have a very hot and important topic to talk about for this week's show. And our guest for this week's show is Representative Eric Nelson, a Republican legislator from Westmoreland County. Welcome so much.
Thank you.
So nice to have you join us, Eric.
Yeah, it's a great opportunity.
So you are a member of the House of Representatives for how long?
I'm 7 years complete, just starting my 8th year now.
Okay.
So, yes.
And for our viewers who don't know, Westmoreland County is just east of Pittsburgh.
Yes, we're Western Pennsylvania, heavy Steeler country over there. So there's Allegheny County and then Westmoreland County. So right at the New Stanton exit of the Turnpike, which is a great landmark for people to know.
Okay. And your background, where before you were in the state legislature, what did you do?
Well, I'm a former Marine, small business owner. You know, we have, I'm fortunate to have a wife far better than I deserve, you know, so we have.
Congratulations.
Yes. 7 kids on 70 acres right now, and it's like a small beef operation. We got some chickens and some goats, and really my background is a small business guy, and I have, we work in steel, power, petrochemical, as safety consulting and large-scale mechanical contracting, and then I also started teaching through the years at IUP in their safety sciences department.
Very good. What committees are you serving on in the State House?
Well, we're in an interesting time in the State House right now because, this standoff over the Speaker and not gaveling us in. So right now, the Pennsylvania House is frozen. No committee assignments.
Let's go back. Which committee assignments did you have?
Yes. So I have been on Labor and Industry Committee and on the Insurance Committee. I'm a Deputy Policy Chair, which covers a lot of different topics. In the past, I've served on the Aging Committee. I was on State Government Committee last session, and then also on Consumer Affairs. So pretty fortunate to be able to serve in a lot of capacities, and have served a number of years on the Human Services Committee as well.
Well, you come at a very interesting time in state government for the reason that you've just mentioned. We have a standoff, it seems, in the State House of Representatives here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania over organizing the State House of Representatives after this election cycle. Could you please fill our viewers in on what's happening, what's happened, what may happen? How do we get out of this impasse?
Well, it is unique times, not completely uncharted waters where the House has in the past been very close in their numbers, but this election cycle was unique because every 10 years, there's a redistricting process, and significant change happened during this redistricting cycle. And so
but this redistricting cycle was driven by the state Supreme Court, wasn't it?
Yes, yeah, and in my position, I know I have a little bit of bias in that view, but when you have a 5-2 Supreme Court, they appointed a former Pitt chancellor who was necessarily, in my opinion, motivated to try to establish some balance. And in that process, he pitted 12 Republicans against each other, drew their districts in together. Ultimately, I think it ended up as 10. So that eliminated 5 Republican seats and then created new, what he referred to as opportunity zones in more urban areas that created a higher number of Democratic seats. So it's a new landscape in Pennsylvania.
Well, it's interesting how partisanship seems to have crept into, in a large way, into the court and into the redistricting process. So those are future shows that we have to do.
Yes, and I'm a big believer of the Constitution and have high faith, in our judicial system, because really it's three equal branches of government.
Sure.
And when we talk about the Constitution and how the Constitution is an overriding document, there are some part of this standoff right now, is associated with potential amendments that might be coming to the Constitution.
Well, where are we? Where do we stand in the House of Representatives right now, Eric?
So right now, there are 101 Republicans. There are 98 Democrats. A deal was apparently cut, and then broken with current Speaker Rossi and House Republican leadership, that he was going to switch and become an independent. And once he was voted in, he didn't switch. So that has created a stalemate. His prime driver, in my opinion, was to run the statute of limitations bill, which is really a bill that creates an opportunity for victims of sexual abuse, and the background on that, and I truly empathize with Speaker Rossi.
And this was a bill that was recommended several years ago when Josh Shapiro was serving as Attorney General, and of course now he's our governor. But as Attorney General, his grand jury report recommended that this statute of limitations be lifted for a 2-year time frame. That was one of the 3 recommendations, wasn't it?
Yes, and I think now Governor Shapiro, that was one of the 40th statewide investigations. It was one of the largest in the country, and specifically focused on the Catholic Church, and really identified some egregious activity within the church where there was almost an organized negligence, and what the report showed, victims of sexual abuse, childhood victims of sexual abuse, such a terrible, terrible crime, and
yes.
Sometimes the ability to come forward with those claims for some of those victims, currently, there's a limited amount of time by statute in the Pennsylvania Constitution where people can come forward and file those claims. And, now Governor Shapiro's, then Attorney General, identified that there are a number of victims out there that never came forward. And I think the original intent of this legislation, which I voted for in its first form, was to allow that statute a 2-year window to be able to move forward and let these previous victims file claims and seek justice.
Mm-hmm. So we had a period of time where the victims that were subject to this treatment from the Catholic Church or its personnel, they've had a chance to be made whole. They've had 6 of the 7, or is it 7 of the 8, dioceses in Pennsylvania have set up their own funds and have taken and have given out awards, if you will. But now we have the rest of society, don't we?
Yes, and it's important to recognize it's not just the Catholic Church. That
right.
examination focused on the Catholic Church, but I think it was in 2018, the Jehovah's Witnesses, that organization, they had 4 individuals with criminal charges brought against them, and there is a difference in the world of criminal charges and civil charges that we may talk about, but this window and the report really focused on the church and not necessarily some of the other institutions that could be impacted depending on the wording of that final legislation.
And this recommendation calls for a lifting of the statute of limitations for 2 years so that other sexual abuse survivors can file to be made whole. But there were 2 approaches to take on this. One, we could do it as regular legislation, or 2, we could do it as a constitutional amendment. And the legislature was choosing to do it as a constitutional amendment. Can you say why and tell us where we are here, where we're going with this now?
Yes, and I'm a believer agreeing that is the most appropriate choice, because Pennsylvania Constitution is unique to have this remedies clause in there, where our Constitution is different from the federal Constitution, where we are limited in the amount of that window in time, so that if somebody passed a bill in and of itself to open up a window where there's a set period of time when lawsuits could be filed, it's a very dangerous precedent, because you could then pass a future law that could open up a different window about, might be an environmental bill. It could be about any other number of situations. And so in our Pennsylvania Constitution, it's extremely clear there is a set window and cap. And so really the goal of the statute of limitations is to have voters decide if they want to open up our Constitution for this 2-year window.
Mm-hmm. And a year ago, the General Assembly both chambers had agreed to do this in a constitutional amendment situation. You have to have 2 General Assemblies pass it in succession, and then the voters get to approve or disapprove of it. And as I understand it, and you could enlighten us some more on this, that first time around when it was passed by both chambers, the Secretary of State's office didn't advertise it as required by state law for the upcoming election, and therefore we have to start all over again, don't we?
Well, it's
am I describing this right, Eric?
It's great that your show is called Behind the Scenes, because
behind the headlines.
Behind the headlines, yes, behind the headlines, because really, it's an unprecedented and an administration that has a Secretary of State who, they said it was an oversight that they failed to advertise the constitutional amendment in advance.
This was under Governor Wolf.
Under Governor Wolf, there were a series of constitutional amendments, and this you may recall, or viewers may recall, back when the constitutional amendment to strip the governor of his executive order powers to be able to end the extended state of emergency that we were in through COVID. Well, multiple constitutional amendments were going on the ballot. This statute of limitation was just one of, I think, 4. 3 were advertised and 1 was not advertised. Now, one could speculate, how can you remember to advertise 3 but not necessarily this 4th?
How can you?
Well, again, on the House floor, we're not allowed to speculate on intent, but I think the consequence was extremely clear. It resulted in ultimately, and that was Secretary Boockvar at the time, who was really under a lot of heated controversy for substantial changes to Pennsylvania's election laws and confusions about that. And ultimately, she was discharged or stepped away from her post because of such a horrific, incompetent failure with statute of limitations. But that's a show for another day. The landing place of appointed people, because a Secretary of State she was appointed by the governor.
Correct.
She had a number of extremely unique actions, ultimately leaving, causing her separation. But now she works in D.C. She works at the Brennan Center, living a pretty good life down there. The Brennan Center is, earning a nice salary, and interesting, the landing place of appointed government officials when their service time ends. I think we had that same thing with the head of our DEP, now is the head of the Sierra Club in Pennsylvania's version. So the who, what, and why as to what happened, it's really a shame. But the consequence, unprecedented. The legislature, the House and the Senate, in 2 sessions voted and agreed that this statute should be opened. And a key provision in the original version was this issue of sovereign immunity. And I think really there's so much emotion for victims of sexual abuse, that when it came around the second time, there was massive emotion on the floor. I mean, it's just terrible. And the fact that a Secretary of State refused to, or ironically failed to, advertise and take that, will of the legislature away from the people, it's terrible. But they missed, or it was not highlighted, the language was changed. So the original constitutional amendment that Secretary Boockvar failed to advertise is different than this current one. And that's what brought me from a yes vote for the first one to a no vote. I was one of just a handful of Republicans in the House who voted against it last time. And it's a tough vote, because I'm great friends with Representative Gregory, who's one of the prime sponsors here, and on this issue, the change is where we differ.
This is a good place to stop and take a break, and we'll be right back with more right after this.
Behind the Headlines is brought to you as a public service by the Pennsylvania State Association of Township Supervisors, the largest, most influential municipal association in the Commonwealth. Since 1921, PSATS has been preserving and strengthening township government and securing greater visibility and involvement for townships in the state and federal political arenas. Covering 95% of Pennsylvania's land mass, townships represent 5.5 million residents, more than any other type of political subdivision in Pennsylvania. Additional underwriting provided by the Worrell Corporation Foundation, based in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, by the Edward H. and Jeannie Arnold Foundation, and by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business. Behind the Headlines is also supported as a public service by the Pennsylvania Highway Information Association, the go-to source to learn about transportation projects and issues. Visit pahighwayinfo.org.
Hi, welcome back to Behind the Headlines. I'm Charlie Greenewald, and on this week's edition I have Representative Nelson here to talk about removing the statute of limitations for sexual abuse cases in Pennsylvania for 2 years. We've covered some of the background, and we're at the point where we are currently at in the General Assembly. Susquehanna Valley Center, of course, we have been in existence for over 25 years, and our role is to provide background for the legislators, information that they might not have at hand. And we are, for example, interested in accountability, transparency, efficiency, and effectiveness. And we wondered, for example, if we passed this piece of legislation, how much would it cost? How much would it cost? How many claims might there be? We weren't certain, so we hired an economics professor from Villanova, Dr. Peter Selesky, and Dr. Selesky worked with us, and we just issued a report that you can access from the Susquehanna Valley Center, and it showed us that we could have anywhere from 10,000 claims to 100,000 claims, and we could have a possible cost for this action that would run anywhere from $5 billion to $32.5 billion. That's the best range that we could get with the data and with the information that we have available at this point. And we use 3 different types of methodology to reach these figures. We held a press conference in the state capitol the other day and presented this information to the legislature. What you folks do with it will be remaining to be seen. We hope that it will help you decide how to proceed. We think that when the legislature's putting together public policy, that they should have an idea of how much things cost, for example. But where do we go from here?
Well, and the report was helpful, I think, also to kind of raise awareness about this sovereign immunity issue. The original version of the statute of limitations maintained that sovereign immunity, which establishes a cap on government organizations. So the new version removes that cap in 3 different ways. And so what that means to public school systems, which this report goes to, but also to our counties, to our community pools, to our ice hockey arenas, paddle boats, all of those areas where we have government immunity. I served on the school board for a short time, and I spoke with some of our local districts and their solicitors. Hey, what could be the consequence of an uncapped civil claim? And there's a lot there, but an uncapped settlement and a civil level or threshold, it's different than a criminal claim requires a burden of proof. A civil claim requires an inference of negligence and does not require evidence to be filed. And that's why I think that number in the report is so large, because I think it's maybe 15,000 claims nationally on average, associated with school districts, and they're thinking possibly 17,000, here in Pennsylvania. But why that number goes up is because myself and a buddy could say, hey, this happened to us 25 years ago, and the teacher has passed away, the administration has passed away, there's no one around, and if we can infer that the district was negligent or potentially negligent in their actions, that claim can advance with uncapped settlement requests.
How are you going to approach this in the legislature, Eric? Will the approach or the thinking be the same in the Senate and the House, or will they take perhaps different approaches?
Well, there's part of the standoff we touched on. The Republicans really want voter ID. Speaker Rozzi really wants the statute of limitations.
This is statewide.
Statewide statute of limitations. So you could see a potential where there may be a moving forward of this amendment, even though it could be pretty serious consequence across both school districts, because basically a vote for statute of limitations is almost a vote to increase property taxes.
Speaker Rossi has announced that he will move no legislation in the State House of Representatives until the statute of limitations amendment is passed.
Yes.
How do we deal with that when we don't even know if he's going to be the speaker or not? This is such a complicated situation.
It is, and we have SB 1, which the Senate, who is functioning and governing, and they advanced a package SB 1, which includes the statute of limitations and voter ID and regulatory reform. So the Senate is saying, we'll move your statute of limitations, but you can't just have it your way. And this is a gentleman, a lot of respect for the Speaker, who made a commitment to switch his party, and then
he delivered a public speech after the deal was struck that he would be speaker, where he claimed to the public, to the people of Pennsylvania, that he was going to be an independent.
He did,
and then changed his mind within a week, the span of a weekend.
And I recognize, his goal is to get the statute of limitations on the ballot, and if that is his goal, there's a pathway for him to achieve it. But what voters have to realize is if there is an agreement made for voter ID and statute of limitations, the potential consequence of not having a sovereign immunity clause is really a game changer. Because particularly for public school systems, there is already a cap of a maximum 3% that property taxes can go up. So, and also this study, I'm coming from an IUP background and read a lot of studies, but the study is limited in a number of ways. It focuses only on public schools, and it focuses on average of settlements of other sexual, claims of similar nature. But we have to recognize the Boy Scout claim, an uncapped claim, $850 million. That's coming from 2021, 2020. We have to recognize the U.S. Olympic team with a doctor who was involved, and that was another situation, $380 million. So the report, I think, is an extremely helpful tool, but there are aspects that are very conservative, saying that, hey, we could range between 300,000 and 500,000, where we could also range from 1 million to 5 million. And that's why there's so much
of individual claims.
Yes. And so a school district that can only raise property taxes 3%, what will happen to those 500 school districts across the state is many of them may not be able to keep pace. And so what is intended as a really emotional opportunity for 40-year-old victims who they didn't come forward. And I totally agree with an opportunity to give them their day. But school districts have sovereign immunity. And this amendment removes the sovereign immunity in 3 different ways. So for school districts in particular, current claims that are limited by the sovereign immunity cap now qualify to be uncapped. And so I'm not an attorney, so I just listen to those attorneys. But that means that current claims in the system that are functioning, they fall underneath this burden, right? And so that means they also qualify to have that sovereign immunity $250,000 cap removed.
So, Representative, in the last 3 minutes of the show, what's going to happen with this? It will go to a vote of the people of Pennsylvania. And how do we expect that to turn out? And what does this mean for the financial health of the Commonwealth? And what does this mean for the community of people who have been victimized?
Well, in the midst of a standoff, who knows, how it's going to end. It could end in the removal of Speaker Rossi. In this, there are special elections that are happening in just a few weeks, and there may be changes in the House. It could mean that Speaker Rossi agrees to the deal and move both of them, and then it's up to shows like this to be able to educate voters for school district concerns and county concerns, for them to understand. I truly empathize with the victims of sexual abuse, and the original version was different than the current version. This current version, we should take our time, in my opinion, and do it right. We should, unfortunately, I think Speaker Rossi doesn't want to wait, and he recognizes that as this information gets out, not just school districts, but those community pools, the ice rinks, any government institution would be open to those claims of negligence. So it's going to be an interesting couple of months.
Oh my, yes, it certainly shall be, and this will be sort of the a unusual start to a new General Assembly. Where do we go from here in the last 30 seconds? Where do we go from here on this issue of statute of limitations? The vote of the public will be the final say on this.
I mean, I'm an optimist, and I'm truly a believer in the intelligence of the voters of Pennsylvania. So if this does move forward, then voters will have the say, and they'll really be the ones in control of what will happen next, both for voter ID and for the statute of limitations.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for being with us today, Representative. And thank you very much for being with us again for another episode of Behind the Headlines. We'll see you next week.